think the first thing we need to understand is that when real estate is going to change hands under federal environmental law, you must perform environmental due diligence. And this is a federal law, as I stated, so I think it's important that we all understand what environmental due diligence accomplishes. First, for the purchaser of the land, if they perform environmental due diligence, they will be granted the innocent landowner defense. For real estate lenders that want to loan money, as long as they have environmental due diligence, then they're granted the lender liability defense. And that is why starting in the mid-90s, you didn't see a commercial property loan approved without having environmental due diligence performed. One thing that is oftentimes misunderstood but critical for people to understand is that environmental due diligence only protects you from the government. It does not protect you from impacted third parties like a neighbor. Also, if a new real estate owner or someone working for them should exacerbate an existing pollution problem at a site, or if they add to the pollution problem at the site, then all bets are off and the government can come after you. So the misunderstanding that a lot of people have out there is that once they get a phase 1 or phase 2, whatever it may be, they think that they have total indemnification, but they do not. They only have indemnification from governmental agencies. What are the components of environmental due diligence? Well, first off, a Phase 1 site assessment, which is located on page 6 of the training manual. With a Phase 1 site assessment, our research shows that roughly 50% of the Phase 1s are inaccurate. I have talked with environmental engineers that have gone as far as saying that 90% of Phase 1 studies are inaccurate. It's important to understand what the purpose of a Phase 1 study is and why there are so many holes. A Phase 1 is a cursory overview, and they are only checking for a few areas in a Phase 1. The first thing they will check is the historical use of the property to see if any past uses of the property would lend one to think potentially there could be any environmental problems with the subject property. The second thing they do in a Phase 1 site assessment is they do a 2-mile radius search to see if any properties within 2 miles have been identified as having contamination, and could that contamination migrate onto the property they are conducting the Phase 1 site assessment on. When environmental strategists discuss who are your neighbors, we mean at a minimum a 2-mile radius, which is in line with the federally recognized environmental due diligence. The radius of who your neighbors are has to adjust depending upon the environmental exposure. For example, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they had to use a radius that was at a minimum hundreds, if not thousands of miles. The global nuclear fallout that occurred from the Japan earthquake and the meltdown of the nuclear reactors, obviously they used a global radius. I mention these examples because oftentimes people are shocked that you would use a search as big as 2 miles out to identify potential contaminators. But as you can see, just from these 2 examples, 2 miles is a bare minimum. Remember, 2 miles just meets government standards, and just meeting government standards is not always reflective of best practices. Lastly, in a Phase 1, they'll do a visual walkover of the property to see if they can identify any issues that could give rise to an environmental problem, such as stained soil or a vent pipe sticking out of the ground identifying an abandoned underground storage tank. If they do not find anything else, then that is it. You have met environmental due diligence, and you can file your BEA, Baseline Environmental Assessment. Make sure your Phase 1 site assessment includes AAI, All Appropriate Inquiry, Endangered Species Assessment, Vapor Intrusion. We'll be discussing these items in just a few moments. Throughout the Environmental Strategist Certification Series, you will hear me repeat some issues several times, and Vapor Intrusion and All Appropriate Inquiry are a couple you will hear me repeat several times. Speaking of which, next in the manual on page 7 is AAI, or All Appropriate Inquiry. The purpose of AAI is to update the ASTM Phase 1 and Phase 2 studies. And the reason for this is because we realize there are several problems with Phase 1 and Phase 2 site assessments, and so ASTM realized they needed to make improvements on the Phase 1 and Phase 2 site assessments. All site assessments should incorporate AAI. If you have any clients that need to have environmental due diligence performed, make sure they include AAI. That is all part of the innocent landowner defense. If through the Phase 1 site assessment they determine you could have environmental exposures or contaminants above allowable government standards, then you move into a Phase 2 site assessment. In a Phase 2 site assessment, they start to punch holes in the ground and gather samples to determine if there's contamination, and if so, is the contamination exceeding government standards? If contamination levels are below government standards, then you file your BEA, a baseline environmental assessment, which we will review in just a moment, with the appropriate environmental regulatory agency, and you're all done. If through the Phase 2 site assessment they determine that you have levels of contamination above government standards, then you move into a Phase 3 site assessment, or what some people call a RAP, Remedial Action Plan. A Phase 3 site assessment identifies the remedial action or cleanup plan to be executed, the time to remediate the site, the cost to remediate the site, the level of cleanup to be achieved because they can't always clean up to meet government standards. For environmental due diligence, that is your Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3 site assessments. BEA on page 7, a baseline environmental assessment. A baseline environmental assessment does just what it sounds like. It gives you a baseline of the current environmental condition of the property, so you can delineate new from old contamination. In other words, it allows you to identify liable parties. The BEA offers you protection, but it only protects you from the government. It does not protect you from impacted third parties like neighbors. And if you exacerbate or add to the contamination, then all bets are off with the government, and you can be held liable. BEA categories, it's important to understand these because based upon the category can determine how you want to develop or use a property. You have Category N, which means no significant hazardous substances will be used by the new property owner or operator of the property. Category D, which means the hazardous substances to be used will be different from the existing contamination. And you have Category S, which means the same hazardous substances will be used that match the existing contamination on the property. It is important to know that filing an improper BEA can cost you up to $25,000 per day per violation, which leads to the question, who are you doing business with? Make sure you're hiring an environmental engineering firm that can demonstrate they have extensive experience with environmental site assessments and BEAs.